I just could pitch, and the master just give me an arm, and it was hard to beat me. You couldn't hardly beat me. See, I could go 17, 18 innings. You ask some of those guys, and they'll tell you. I wouldn't get tired because I practice every day. I had the suit on every day. Put in there 365 days out of the year, I had that baseball suit.
Rock bottom came into focus in 2024 when baseball finally changed the official record of Satchel Paige. For decades, the record book said he won 28 games and lost 31 across his career. They said he struck out 288 batters in total. Those numbers made him look like a solid pitcher who showed up late in life and did fine, respectable work. But in May of 2024, Major League Baseball took the huge step of adding statistics from 7 separate Negro Leagues into its official history. Suddenly, Paige's win total jumped from 28 all the way up to 124. His losses adjusted along with that shift. His earned run average dropped from 3.29 down to 2.73. His strikeout total rocketed from 288 up to 1,501. One single season, 1944, showed an earned run average of just 1.01, and that mark became the third lowest single season earned run average in the entire history of Major League Baseball. For one moment, the sport finally looked at Satchel Paige and admitted, on paper, what people who actually watched him pitch had known the whole time. He was one of the greatest pitchers who ever lived. The numbers alone, all by themselves, tell a story of dominance that lasted decades, not just a handful of seasons squeezed in near the end of his life. And if stories like this deserve to be remembered, use the hype feature and give this video some hype so more people can see what baseball took from him. That good news should feel like a full victory, and in many ways it truly is. But it also forces a much harder question to the surface. Why did it take until decades after his death for baseball's official records to even begin reflecting what he had done on the mound? Paige was alive for most of the 20th century. He pitched in front of enormous crowds across several countries. Famous white ball players admitted openly that he was the best they had ever faced. And still, the very sport that praised him refused to count most of his work for almost 80 years. This was not a simple case of forgetfulness or paperwork lost in a drawer somewhere. Baseball did not accidentally misplace the record of Satchel Paige. A segregated system built real walls around him during the best years of his life, and those walls are the true story hiding underneath the statistics. To understand exactly what was taken from him, we have to go back to where his story started, long before anyone in the country called him great. We have to go back before the crowds, before the fame, before the jokes about his age, to a childhood shaped almost entirely by poverty and by a legal system built to keep a black family down. Leroy Paige was born around July 7, 1906, in Mobile, Alabama. Nobody kept perfect birth records for black families in Alabama at that time, so even his exact birthday stayed uncertain for the rest of his life. He was the 7th of 12 children in his family. His father, John, worked as a gardener, tending other people's yards for small wages. His mother, Lula, worked as a washerwoman, scrubbing other families' clothes by hand for pay. The Paige family lived in a poor black neighborhood in the Jim Crow South, a place where laws and daily customs kept black families locked out of good jobs, decent schools, and fair pay at almost every turn. There was no spare money in the household for baseball gloves, bats, or real equipment of any kind. With 12 children to feed on a gardener's wages and a washerwoman's wages, every extra coin in the Paige household went toward food and rent rather than toys or games. Young Leroy and the other children in his neighborhood threw rocks at tin cans instead, just to have something resembling a game to play in whatever free time they had. It was a small thing, throwing rocks at cans, but it also quietly built the arm strength and the sharp aim that would later define his entire pitching career, long before anyone thought to call it training. To help his large family survive, Leroy took a job carrying luggage at the Louisville and Nashville Rail Depot in Mobile. Passengers stepped off arriving trains with heavy bags, and porters like young Leroy carried those bags for a few coins at a time. Carrying one bag at a time was slow work, and slow work meant less money at the end of a long day. So Leroy built his own simple tool to solve the problem. He tied a pole and some rope together into a harness, which let him carry 3 or 4 satchels across his shoulders at once, like a walking shelf built from spare parts. One of the other porters watched him struggling under all that weight and joked that he looked just like a walking satchel tree. The nickname stuck immediately. From that day forward, people across Mobile and eventually across the whole country called him Satchel. It is worth pausing on where that name truly came from. It did not come from fame, fortune, or a clever marketing idea. It came from a poor black child solving a hard problem created by grinding labor and low pay, all so his family could get by another week. Every time the name Satchel appeared later in headlines celebrating his pitching pitching, it carried that quiet origin story along with it, whether the writers using the name knew it or not. That same daily hardship eventually pushed him toward real trouble with the law. As a young boy, Leroy was arrested for shoplifting and for skipping school, two offenses closely tied to growing up in a family with too little money and too few honest chances available to it. At age 12, a judge sentenced him to the Alabama Industrial School for Negro Children in Mount Meigs, Alabama. This was a state reform school, and Leroy remained locked away there until he was about 17 years old. Being separated from his family for roughly 5 years was a heavy, painful price to pay for a childhood shaped far more by poverty than by any real wrongdoing on his part. Inside that reform school, though, something unexpected happened that would change the entire direction of his life. A coach named Edward Byrd and a minister named Reverend Moses Davis both noticed the tall, lanky boy, and together they moved him away from first base and toward the pitcher's mound instead. Leroy stood about 6'4", with long arms, long legs, and wide shoulders built naturally for throwing hard, fast pitches. Byrd taught him to pull his arm back deep before ever releasing the ball. He taught him a high leg kick that seemed to block out the entire sky in front of a nervous batter's eyes. He taught him to hold the ball until the very last possible moment before letting go, so hitters could never quite read his grip in time to react properly. Byrd also trained him to study a batter's knees and posture closely, almost the way a careful hunter studies an animal's smallest movements, so Leroy could guess what a hitter planned to do before the swing even truly started. These were not casual tips passed along in a few minutes between chores. They were patient, repeated lessons, given day after day inside a locked institution that, ironically, had more time and structure to offer a talented boy than the segregated schools of Mobile ever did. Years later, as a grown man, Paige looked back at those 5 years and said plainly that he had traded 5 years of his own freedom just to learn how to pitch properly. That single sentence carries the whole painful contradiction sitting at the center of his early life. The free world outside those prison walls, the segregated schools, the segregated towns, the segregated leagues, offered him almost nothing in the way of real opportunity. It was a locked institution, of all possible places, that gave him structure, real coaching, and the raw skill that would eventually make him famous across the entire country. That is not a happy story to tell. It is a quiet warning about just how much opportunity was missing everywhere else in the world around him. A 12-year-old boy should never need a jail sentence to find a coach willing to teach him. But in a segregated Alabama town, the reform school was one of the only places willing to invest real time and real attention in a poor black child with obvious talent. Everywhere else, the doors that should have opened for him simply stayed shut. Paige was released from Mount Meigs in 1923 and returned home to Mobile. He pitched first for local semi-professional teams, including the Mobile Tigers and a squad known as the Down the Bay Boys. In 1926, he signed his first true professional contract with the Chattanooga Black Lookouts of the Negro Southern League, earning $50 a month for his work. A year later, the Birmingham Black Barons of the Negro National League signed him for $275 a month, a genuine jump in pay for a young, unproven pitcher. He wasted no time proving that he truly belonged on that stage. In both 1928 and 1929, he led his entire league in strikeouts, while posting a sharp 2.32 earned run average across those seasons. On April 29, 1929, he struck out 17 batters in a single game against the Cuban Stars, a total that actually beat the recognized white major league record of 16 strikeouts, a mark held jointly by pitchers Noodles Hahn and Rube Waddell. Just 6 days later, he topped even that remarkable performance, striking out 18 batters against the Nashville Elite Giants in another single game. Two dominant outings within the same week, against two different teams, showed that his April 29 performance was no fluke. It was simply what Satchel Paige could do on a good week, at a time when almost nobody outside the Negro Leagues was paying close attention. Stop and think carefully about what that really means. In 1929, a young black pitcher playing in a segregated league was already throwing better, by the official numbers, than the recognized major league record. He was already, by any honest and fair measure, one of the very best pitchers alive anywhere in the country, and Major League Baseball would not let him anywhere near its fields, its stadiums, or its official record books. His talent was never seriously in question among people who actually watched him. His skin color was the only real barrier standing between him and the sport's biggest possible stage. That painful gap between what he had already proven on a rural diamond and what the wider baseball world allowed him to receive in return is exactly where his personal tragedy truly begins to take shape. Every strikeout he recorded in those early years should have counted toward a growing national reputation inside organized baseball. Instead, each one simply added to a private, regional legend that most of white America never even heard about until years years later, if it heard about it at all. Because Negro League teams were so often short on steady money, Paige could not simply sit back and collect one dependable paycheck the way a white major leaguer of similar talent could. Team owners in black baseball struggled constantly with thin budgets, unpredictable ticket sales, and entire seasons that could collapse without much warning at all. So Paige turned himself into something closer to a traveling attraction than an ordinary contracted ball player. He pitched at different points for the Pittsburgh Crawfords, the Cleveland Cubs, the New York Black Yankees, the Memphis Red Sox, the Philadelphia Stars, and the Kansas City Monarchs, often moving toward whichever team or promoter offered him the strongest deal in a given season. In some years, he drove more than 30,000 miles across the country, crisscrossing back roads to pitch in exhibition games almost every single day of the season. During winters, when many players might have rested, he kept right on working in leagues across Puerto Rico, Cuba, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic, because the need for money simply did not pause just because the calendar turned cold. This constant, grinding schedule placed enormous strain on his arm and on his whole body, a level of strain that a white major league star would rarely have faced in the very same way. Major league pitchers of that era, while still overworked by today's careful standards, at least played inside defined seasons, held guaranteed contracts, and had access to team doctors when something went wrong. Paige had almost none of those protections for most of his career. His arm and his body were his only real financial asset, and he had to keep selling their performance game after game, town after town, simply to stay afloat. Barnstorming meant traveling from town to town and playing extra games for money, and for a player like Paige, it was far less a personal choice than a hard necessity forced on him by a sport that refused to hire him properly in the first place. Every mile driven on those rough back roads was a mile he had to drive because no stable major league contract was ever offered to him. Every extra game pitched on a tired arm was a game he had to pitch because a single steady salary, the kind white players took for granted, simply did not exist for a black pitcher of his era. Season after season, this pattern repeated itself, wearing down a body that deserved real protection rather than endless improvisation just to keep food on the table. In 1937, the Dominican Republic's dictator, Rafael Trujillo, paid Paige and several other black stars large sums of money to play for his own team, called the Dragones de Ciudad Trujillo. Paige led that club to a championship while armed soldiers stood watch over the games from the sidelines, a strange and tense reminder of just how far political power could reach directly into a ballplayer's working life. Paige had traveled thousands of miles from Alabama to pitch under the eyes of soldiers in a foreign country, all because the country where he was born would not let him pitch on its own biggest stage. Back home in the United States, a car dealer named Neil Churchill hired Paige in 1935 to pitch for a fully integrated team based in Bismarck, North Dakota, playing alongside fellow black stars Chet Brewer and Quincy Troup. In just 3 months that season, Paige appeared in more than 60 separate games, posting a remarkable 30-2 record while averaging nearly 15 strikeouts a game. That Bismarck team went on to win the National Baseball Congress Championship down in Wichita, Kansas, where Paige alone struck out 66 batters across the full tournament. It was one of the few settings of that era where black and white players took the field together as full teammates. Proof that integrated baseball worked perfectly well whenever anyone actually allowed it to happen. Along the way, Paige also faced white major league stars directly during off-season exhibition tours, matchups that never counted in any official record book. Dizzy Dean said flatly that Paige had the greatest pitching arm he had ever personally seen on a baseball field. Joe DiMaggio later called him the best and fastest pitcher he had ever batted against in his entire career. These were not small or throwaway compliments. These were two of the most respected names in the entire sport, openly admitting that a man they were not legally allowed to play alongside during the regular season might genuinely be the best pitcher of them all. Their praise never once translated into an actual contract offer, an official statistic, or a spot on a major league roster. It simply became another story people told about Paige, admired from a safe distance, while the sport itself kept its doors closed to him. To survive that endless workload year after year, Paige built a whole arsenal of different pitches, along with a showman's flair to go with each one. He had his main fastball, which he proudly called the B-ball, because it would simply be right where he wanted it to be. He also threw the jump ball and the hurry-up ball, two pitches built purely around deception and timing. He mixed in a wobbly ball, a screwball, and a pitch he liked to call the bat dodger. Most famous of all was his hesitation pitch, where he paused briefly mid-motion before finally releasing the ball, throwing off a hitter's timing completely and often drawing a laugh from the crowd. Sometimes, purely to entertain the fans who had paid to watch him, he would wave his own outfielders in to sit down on the infield grass and then strike out the side without the ball ever reaching them at all. It was a bold trick, and it worked because his control was precise enough to guarantee it, but it also meant every outing carried the pressure of a live performance on top of the pressure of the game itself. Crowds absolutely loved this kind of spectacle. But underneath all that showmanship sat a harder, quieter truth. Paige had to turn himself into pure entertainment because ticket sales, and not any steady league salary, were what actually kept him paid from week to week. A white major league pitcher could rely on his contract alone. Paige had to sell every single outing to the people in the stands, night after night, simply to guarantee that the money would keep coming in. All of that constant overuse eventually caught up with his body. In 1938, while pitching in Mexico, Paige suffered a serious shoulder injury that left his arm nearly paralyzed for a period of time. Many team owners around the league quietly assumed his playing career was finished for good, but Kansas City Monarchs owner J.L. Wilkinson saw real value in Paige beyond just his fastball, and he signed him to the team's traveling B squad, offering him medical rest, dental care, and time to properly recover. During that slow recovery, Paige essentially reinvented the way he approached pitching. Instead of leaning only on raw, natural speed, he sharpened his control and learned to mix in slower breaking pitches along with subtle changes of speed to keep hitters off balance. When he finally rejoined the Monarchs' main roster, he helped lead the team to 4 straight Negro American League pennants from 1939 through 1942, along with a full Negro World Series title in 1942. His recovery from that injury was genuinely remarkable by any standard, but it should never be mistaken for proof that the wider system around him was fair or reasonable. No pitcher should ever need to fully reinvent his own body just to survive a workload forced on him by simple economic exclusion. A white major league star with a nearly paralyzed arm would have received full season rest, careful team medical attention, and a guaranteed contract waiting for him on the other side of recovery. Paige had to rely on the personal generosity of one owner, J.L. Wilkinson, simply to get the basic rest and care that should have been standard for any professional pitcher. Without that one owner's decision, Paige's story might have ended quietly in Mexico in 1938, his name fading out of the sport entirely, decades before anyone ever debated where he belonged in the record books. For nearly 2 full decades, Satchel Paige had carried black baseball on his shoulders, almost single-handedly, drawing huge crowds, earning quiet respect from opposing white stars, and proving again and again that he truly belonged among the very best pitchers alive. Meanwhile, white pitchers of similar or even lesser talent built national followings, appeared regularly in official record books, and secured stable, protected careers inside a fully supported league system built for their benefit. They never had to drive 30,000 miles a year to stay employed. They never had to invent trick pitches just to entertain a crowd into paying for another ticket. They simply had to show up, pitch, and let the league's own structure take care of the rest. When Jackie Robinson finally broke Major League Baseball's color barrier in April of 1947, many people who had watched Paige pitch for years assumed he would surely get his own chance next. He was, after all, the most famous and most accomplished black pitcher in the entire country at that time. But Major League team owners, nervous about public backlash to integration itself, leaned instead towards signing younger players who might draw less controversy and less risk. Paige, now well into his 40s, was quietly passed over during that first important wave of signings. It was not until July of 1948 that Cleveland Indians owner Bill Veeck finally signed Paige to his very first major league contract. On July 9, 1948, just 2 days after his 42nd birthday, Paige made his official debut in the American League. He became the first black pitcher in American League history and the 7th black player to appear anywhere in Major League Baseball. Picture that timeline carefully for a moment. A pitcher good enough to beat a Major League record holder's mark back in 1929 did not receive a real Major League chance until nearly 20 full years later, arriving not as a rising young talent, but as a man already deep into his 40s. That gap of 2 entire decades is not some small footnote buried in his biography. It sits at the very center of his personal tragedy. Baseball did not simply overlook Satchel Paige during those lost years. Its segregated structure actively blocked him from the sport's biggest stage during the exact seasons when his arm, his body, and his skill were sitting at their absolute peak. Those lost years cannot be given back to him, no matter how the record books are corrected later on. A 23-year-old arm and a 42-year-old arm are simply not the same thing, and baseball chose to wait for the second one instead of ever reaching for the first. Every fan who watched him pitch in 1948 was watching a diminished version of the pitcher who had once struck out 18 batters in a single game 2 decades earlier, and still, even that diminished version proved good enough to help win a championship. None of this stands as any criticism of Jackie Robinson, who carried his own enormous personal burden and fully deserves every ounce of credit for his courage during that difficult era. The real fault sits entirely with a segregated system that decided who was allowed to compete and who was not, based purely on race rather than any honest measure of ability. Robinson deserves to be remembered as a hero for what he endured. Paige deserves to be remembered for everything the same system took from him while it slowly, cautiously decided he was finally allowed to play. Both men's stories belong side by side, not in competition, as two different faces of the same long injustice. Even arriving so late, Paige still proved exactly how good he truly was on the field. Many critics at the time dismissed his signing as a cheap publicity stunt, assuming an aging Negro League veteran could not possibly hold up under real major league competition. Paige answered every one of those doubts directly on the pitching mound. Over the remainder of the 1948 season, he posted a strong 6-1 record with a sharp 2.50 earned run average, threw 2 complete game shutouts, and pulled in enormous paying crowds, including more than 78,000 fans for a single-night game at Cleveland Municipal Stadium. His steady pitching helped push the Cleveland Indians to the American League pennant that year and, eventually, to a full World Series championship. In that same series, Paige became the very first black pitcher ever to appear in a World Series game, a milestone that, once again, arrived only after the sport had already decided it was finally comfortable enough to allow it. He went on to pitch for the St. Louis Browns from 1951 through 1953, working both as an occasional starter and as a dependable late-inning reliever for that struggling club. He earned selection to the American League All-Star team in both 1952 and 1953, a remarkable honor for a man already well into his mid to late 40s by that point. Across his entire recognized major league career, he finished with a 3.29 earned run average over 475 innings pitched in total. Those numbers alone would be strong for any ordinary pitcher. For a man arriving in his 40s after 2 full decades of exhausting travel and constant overuse, they stand as truly extraordinary. It is worth pausing to ask one simple, painful question here. If Paige had been allowed into the major leagues at 23 years old instead of 42, what might his full career have looked like on paper? Nobody can know that answer for certain, and this script will not invent numbers he never actually recorded during his career. But the very shape of that question alone tells you a great deal about how much was quietly lost along the way. Every one of his major league statistics has to be read with an asterisk hanging silently over it, not because he lacked talent, but because the sport waited until his physical prime had already passed before allowing him to add to those numbers at all. An all-star selection at 46 years old should be read as a sign of just how much talent remained even after the wear of 30,000 miles a year for 2 decades straight. While his pitching earned genuine respect from fans and players alike, the media surrounding him focused constantly on something else entirely: his exact age. Because official birth records from Alabama back in 1906 were incomplete and inconsistent, nobody could say for certain exactly how old Paige really was at any given point. Sports writers turned that simple uncertainty into an endless running joke, treating his age almost like a circus attraction rather than a plain fact about a working man's life. Paige leaned into the joke himself with humor of his own, offering lighthearted sayings such as his advice to avoid fried foods, which he claimed would anger up the blood, and his now famous line about never looking back, because something might just be gaining on you. Those jokes were genuinely charming in their own way, but they also quietly distracted public attention away from something far more serious underneath: the precise control, careful discipline, and real mechanical skill that had kept his arm working long after most ordinary pitchers' careers had already ended for good. It was easier for the press to laugh about his birth certificate than to seriously reckon with the uncomfortable question of why a pitcher his age was only now getting his first real shot at the sport's highest level. Fame on the pitching mound did not translate into any real financial security once he stepped off of it. Unlike the white stars of his own era, Paige had no clear path toward the kind of generational wealth built through long, stable major league careers filled with pensions and paid endorsements. So even well into his 50s, he kept right on working, returning again and again to barnstorming tours and independent league appearances just to keep earning a basic living. On September 25, 1965, at approximately 59 years of age, Kansas City Athletics owner Charlie Finley signed Paige for a single regular season game against the Boston Red Sox. Between innings, Paige sat calmly in a rocking chair placed out in the bullpen, a visual joke clearly aimed straight at the age Paige jokes that had followed him around for years by that point. On the actual mound, though, there was no joke at all to be found. He pitched 3 complete shutout innings that day, allowing only a single hit to Carl Yastrzemski and recording 1 clean strikeout along the way. It remains one of the most remarkable feats of physical endurance in the long history of baseball, but look closely at exactly what it really represents underneath the applause. Baseball happily welcomed Satchel Paige back as a 59-year-old novelty act, something amazed fans could watch and marvel at, while that very same sport had firmly refused him a real, everyday chance during the 20 years when his arm was at its absolute strongest. The same institution that excluded his prime happily profited, in the end, from his old age instead. Fans bought tickets that day mostly out of curiosity, wondering whether an old man could still get outs against a real major league lineup. He answered that curiosity with 3 clean innings, but the applause that followed could not undo the 20 years of prime seasons the sport had already refused to let him play. 3 years later, in 1968, the Atlanta Braves signed Paige once again, this time as a pitcher and part-time trainer for the club. The real reason behind that particular contract had almost nothing to do with baseball performance at all. Paige needed exactly 180 days of major league service time in order to qualify for a full pension and proper health benefits under league rules. Stop and think honestly about what that detail truly means. After roughly 4 full decades of drawing massive paying crowds across cities and countries throughout North America, after entertaining fans for years on end with his arm and his showmanship, Satchel Paige still had to rely on a simple roster technicality just to secure the most basic form of retirement protection available to any working man. That single detail may be the clearest proof of all that his labor was valued far more by the people running the sport than his own long-term welfare ever truly was. A man who had filled stadiums across 3 or 4 countries, who had made owners rich for decades, still had to be quietly slotted onto a roster like a piece of paperwork just to receive the same basic protection that ordinary players received automatically. In 1971, the National Baseball Hall of Fame finally announced that Paige would be inducted into Cooperstown alongside the sport's other legends. At first, though, the plan called for Paige and future Negro League honorees to be placed in a completely separate wing of the museum, kept apart from the main Hall of Fame plaques given to white players before him. Sports writers, civil rights leaders, and even Hall of Fame legend Ted Williams himself spoke out publicly against that separate plan, arguing plainly that Negro League greats deserved full and equal recognition rather than a quietly segregated space of their own. Under that mounting public pressure, the Hall of Fame's own leadership abandoned its segregated wing idea entirely. On August 9, 1971, Paige was officially inducted as a complete, full member of the Baseball Hall of Fame, becoming the very first player ever elected through the newly formed Committee on Negro Leagues. Even that honor, then, almost arrived wrapped in a smaller, separate version of the same exclusion he had faced his entire playing career. It took public pressure, not the Hall of Fame's own first instinct, to finally place him among the game's full and equal legends. Paige spent his final years living quietly in Kansas City, Missouri, together with his wife, Lahoma Brown Paige, and their children close by his side. He died of heart failure on June 8, 1982, at the age of 75. At the exact moment of his death, the official Major League record books still listed him with that modest 28-31 career record and just 288 total strikeouts, numbers pulled only from his brief window of official Major League play between 1948 and 1965. Those thin numbers said nothing at all about the 2 full decades of dominant, exhausting pitching he had already delivered across the Negro Leagues. Countless barnstorming tours and winter leagues stretched around the world. For more than 40 years after his death, the official public record of Satchel Paige remained quietly incomplete, a strange, ongoing continuation of the very same exclusion that had shaped his entire playing career from the very beginning. His family, his fans, and the historians who studied his career all knew the truth was far bigger than those 2 modest numbers. The official record simply had not caught up yet, and it would take 4 more decades before it finally began to. That finally began to change in May of 2024, when Major League Baseball folded the full statistics from 7 major Negro Leagues, active between 1920 and 1948, into its permanent official historical record. Paige's career win total rose from 28 all the way up to 124. His losses adjusted alongside that same major shift. His career earned run average dropped from 3.29 down to 2.73. His total strikeout count climbed from 288 all the way up to 1,501. His remarkable 1.01 earned run average from that 1944 season with the Kansas City Monarchs was officially recognized as the third lowest single-season mark anywhere in the recorded history of Major League Baseball. Even with this long overdue correction, historians openly admit that many barnstorming, independent, and international games still lack complete or reliable box scores. By most careful estimates, Paige actually pitched in more than 2,500 games across his full working career, winning approximately 2,000 of them, with somewhere around 300 shutouts and 55 no-hitters to his name. Those larger figures remain honest historical estimates rather than fully verified official totals, but they hint strongly at just how much of his true career still sits quietly outside the record books. Even today, even after the correction, the 2024 change was real, meaningful progress. It was not, however, a complete repair of everything that had already been lost to him and to history. Thousands of innings he threw on dusty exhibition fields, in front of paying crowds who came specifically to see him, still exist only in memory, in old newspaper clippings, and in the recollections of people who were there. No single correction to a record book can fully restore innings that were never properly written down in the first place. The wide gap between his cold official statistics and the full, honest truth of his career says far less about Satchel Paige himself and far more about a sport that failed to count him properly for the better part of a century. Baseball delayed the truth about Satchel Paige for most of 100 years. In the end, it could not erase him. His name, his arm, and his story outlasted every wall that segregation ever built around him. The record books finally caught up, even if the correction arrived generations too late for him to see it himself. Satchel Paige remains exactly what the people who watched him always knew he was, one of the greatest pitchers this country has ever produced. From a poor boy carrying satchels at a train depot to a Hall of Fame legend whose true numbers took a century to surface, his story stands as proof that talent, once real, cannot stay hidden forever, no matter how long a broken system tries to keep it buried.